I find the recent panpsychism discussion in philosophy, science, and theology one of the most interesting debates in our field, for reasons that I hope these 4 sessions and the book that will later contain them will make clear. I trace the lineage of today's discussion actually back to encountering Whitehead's panpsychism as an undergrad from an evangelical philosophy professor who warned us that it was the very antithesis to all things Christian, which probably in his mind meant satanic. I don't know. I didn't have a rejoinder to his heresy challenge at the time, but I did find that the Whitehead's panpsychic metaphysics that he presented was beautiful, complex, and offered a kind of embracing of science in the modern world that seemed strangely to be missing in the worldview that my evangelical professors were putting forward. I want to say a quick word about panpsychism and idealism, and then I want to try out a thought experiment with you all to see where it takes us. So I hope there'll be a little bit of Leela or play in this. Panpsychism and idealism, this is where I was going to say, only in the absence of Godehard, what it was like to be studying for 4 years at the University of Munich in Germany early in my career. And in particular, discussions I remember with him at the Staatsbibliothek and elsewhere about forms of idealism. And so this first point really was inspired by those conversations and the reading that I was doing at the time. 3 different idealist traditions have influenced and still influence my approach to psyche, mind, world, and God, and thus how I construe questions about mind and matter, mind in matter, matter as mind, or in short, as Tripp and Sarah have put it, the mindfulness of nature. Those 3 traditions are Greek idealism from Plato to Plotinus, idealist influences on Christian theology, particularly from the Neoplatonic tradition, Pseudo-Dionysius and following, and German idealism from roughly Kant to Hegel. But there's the problem. Discussions of panpsychism rarely even acknowledge the distinctions between these 3 traditions, much less the complex range of options that each one of them on its own brings. For example, Thomas Aquinas is often discussed and presented even in context of panpsychism without any acknowledgement of the forms of idealism that he drew on and was influenced by. So in addition to the 3 I just named, later 2 more families of idealism came to play a role in my own thinking. Anglo-American idealists or thinkers who influence Anglo-American idealism. So obviously there's the Harvard School, but also non-Americans, Bergson, Samuel Alexander, Teilhard de Chardin, and Whitehead. That's the 4th. And 5th, and increasingly important for me, the complex forms of idealism in Vedanta, especially Shankara and Ramanuja. I hope you know Jeffrey Long's beautiful interweaving of Whitehead and Ramanuja. So here's where you all come in. It's my hope that your collective minds, will bring the necessary firepower to unpack the idealist assumptions that underlie the forms of panpsychism that you will be introducing. What isn't widely acknowledged, but ought to be if we're going to make progress, are the very different directions that the Whiteheadian and the other idealist influences pull us when it comes to the question of panpsychism. I mean, think about it. Doesn't it strike you as strange that scholars would advance one species of idealism, panpsychism, without acknowledging the range of idealisms that are on offer, and hence without considering which idealisms they are affirming and denying as they advance their views? So I want to take a different tack and think about the very nature of the debate, almost at a meta level. So here's the thought experiment. What does it mean to be a panpsychist, basically? Well, it seems that one is affirming that all is psyche. Well, what does that mean? Well, maybe one is affirming that all that exists is conscious. So for George Berkeley, that might be All that exists are subjects and the contents of their consciousness. For German idealism, it might be the telos, here Hegel, the telos of history is absoluter Geist, absolute spirit. Or in a Whiteheadian world, events are ontologically basic. Or in David Ray Griffin's more careful formulation, all things that exist have experience. What I want to do is attempt three thesis statements, three standpoint statements. And then I want to try to formulate what would be the most intuitive position to come to vis-a-vis panpsychism from the standpoint of metaphysics, theology, and science, respectively. So taking, just if you had a metaphysical perspective, just if you had a theological perspective, just if you had a scientific perspective, what would you be inclined to say, intuitively speaking, about panpsychism? So I want to know from you whether I'm right about these intuitions, and if I'm wrong, why I'm wrong. And only then to begin to bring those three fields together. And then I'm going to close with a four-step argument. Number one, from the standpoint of metaphysics, panpsychism is obviously the most intuitive candidate among the options. So the first thesis statement, from the standpoint of metaphysics, from the perspective of metaphysics, panpsychism is just obviously the most intuitive candidate. Maybe this claim sounds controversial, so two clarifications. First, I mean not theistic metaphysics here. We'll get to theology in a moment separately, and then we'll put them together. But I mean metaphysics generically, and I mean a metaphysics that acknowledges the reality of conscious experience. If you'll give me those two premises, I stand by that claim. Let me make a case for it. Again, I have to say it again in this call. I ask you to remove theology from the equation for a moment. I'll let you bring it back in later, but the thought experiment only works if you'll agree to set it aside for a moment and consider the world around us only from the standpoint of the metaphysician, who again grants the reality of conscious experience. Her question, I think, is the following. What is the simplest, most parsimonious, and most unified single metaphysical theory that can conceptualize our experience and our data about the world around us into a single unified theory and set of categories? That's sort of a definition of metaphysical method, isn't it? If we begin in this way and with this question, we cannot dismiss the existence of consciousness, premise, but we can postulate that all other existing things have some form of experience or awareness. That would be the pan. Dualism is always less metaphysically attractive than monism, because less parsimonious. Hence, panpsychism is the most viable candidate. And I'm going to call this the unified metaphysical theory argument, or UMT. The unified metaphysical theory argument. Second, from the standpoint of Christian theology, if panpsychism is true, it is true only in a derivative sense. If it's true only in a derivative sense. Let me make the case for that one. Here's why I think you should accept this claim about the perspective of Christian theology. First, the primary ontological reality is God. God is the metaphysical ultimate. Of course, theologians have defended dualisms in a disturbing variety of forms, as well as emergentism and panpsychism. But for the theologian, the metaphysics of the created world must represent a derivative question, since the primary metaphysical question is the following. What is the metaphysical ultimate for her, God, and what must be the nature of metaphysically derivative beings, that is, finite and contingent beings, given the nature of that ultimate divine reality? So I'll restate that. What emerges here is that for the Christian theologian, there should be a logical order to the questions one takes on. First, the existence and nature of the metaphysical ultimate, whom, as Thomas Aquinas says, all men call God. Second, why God would create a world and how, given God's nature, created reality would need to be connected to God. So, the theology of nature. And then thirdly, do humans, and derivatively perhaps other created beings, consist of a material body, a psyche, and a spirit, or only two of those, or even just one of those three types of being? So in short, theological anthropology. Again here, by the nature of the case, the metaphysical qualities of God have to form the primary criteria for formulating an answer. Okay, it's a different perspective. And third and finally, from the standpoint of science qua science, panpsychism is not a viable answer to any well-formed question. Maybe that sounds a little controversial, but we could talk for a while about what constitutes the scientific method. And I'm going to skip that because I'm more interested in the debate that we get into after Jonathan's paper. But from the standpoint of science qua science, panpsychism doesn't arise. All right, I hope that's controversial enough to get started. Now, let's bring the three pieces together. What are people really claiming when they maintain that panpsychism is the most adequate theory for those who are concerned with all three fields, metaphysics, theology, and the natural world? So what's that argument? Here's an idealized reconstruction of what I think that argument must be in 4 steps. Step 1, panpsychism is a metaphysical position. So it seems that these scholars who work in this triangle of disciplines, that these scholars must first presuppose some version of the unified metaphysical theory argument that I gave at the beginning. Step 2, those with theological commitments then recognize that their theology does not need to eliminate panpsychism. Indeed, panpsychism might actually make their work easier. Since God is spirit, hence psyche, it makes sense for them to argue that the natural world consists of psyches as well. I mean, after all, it always was difficult to conceive how matter could exist and what matter is, given the traditional affirmation that God does not have a body, that is, that God is not material in any way. It just seems obvious that the theologian's task will be easier if God created finite entities like God's self, psyches, than if God grounded the divine creation in something that God is not, such as matter. So the theologian is happy to embrace this metaphysical position of panpsychism as a derivative, useful effect, given what it means to do a theology centered on a metaphysical ultimate, the divine. Finally, science. The philosophical theologian, or theistic metaphysician, must argue that science can still be about the physical world in something like the ways that the scientists believe it is, even if the nature of that world, from a metaphysical perspective, is actually that it possesses psyche or has experience, or really that all is psyche or all is experience. But the philosophical theologian who's done steps 1 and 2 now comes to science, has to find some way to account for the apparent effectiveness of science so that she can say, okay, I've incorporated science in this way. And I believe that argument, if we're doing this idealist reconstruction, could take place in 2 steps. First, given some natural science, say physics, the scientist could not detect psyche in, say, a carbon atom, even if it is there. She just lacks the methods to do so. The theologian says, well, that's right. We have a theory of error for the scientist's disbelief in psyche, or for her rejection of panpsychism. Given her methods, she simply couldn't detect it, even if it is the active agent, the primary causal force in carbon atoms taking on the form that they do. And second, the theologian must construct an argument for why, if panpsychism is true, scientists detect the empirical patterns that they actually discover in the physical world. The theologian must then argue that what scientists call empirical laws and regularities are actually just what is left over after the psyches have done their work. So empirical laws and regularities, which the scientist thinks she's studying directly, are the residue of the actual causal work that was done by psyches. I have a long section that I'll just summarize to why Whitehead turned out to be a particularly brilliant ally for theologians here, and to offer, actually I'll just read this one paragraph, and provided some specific arguments. What Whitehead calls prehension, the natural scientists calls causal influences on some existing entity. Concrescence is the subjective or experiential becoming of an actual occasion for Whitehead. It's that creative, free process of subjective becoming that the natural scientist can never grasp. But after an actual entity has become, as for Whitehead, it achieves objective immortality and becomes present as a datum to other entities, which is the perfect way to hand off the metaphysics to the scientist and say, no, go ahead, you can study the results of concrescences objectively, and you can capture it in your equations. We could talk about societies of actual occasions, which then could be described by equations as well. So the residue of the real metaphysical stuff is where scientists live for the Whiteheadian. And so for my imagined metaphysical, theological scholar who's trying to make sense of science, Whitehead is the ideal ally. She gets her metaphysics and she gets her theology, and now she can satisfy the scientists, not metaphysically speaking, not with regard to the physical nature of the world, but with regard to the data that science comes up with. So she gets to be right about God, gets to be right about metaphysics, and can account for why scientists think they're studying a physical world. Hence, a kind of theological panpsychism and its attraction. All right, so in closing, this is the final or fourth step in this argument, that panpsychism is the best metaphysical position for the three-way dialogue between metaphysics, theology, and the natural sciences. And the final step is the appeal to parsimony. A metaphysics of emergence, such as the one I have defended in my writings, is hopelessly pluralistic. Emergentists detect different kinds of entities or agents, and if they take the ontological position that I do, then they ascribe actual existence to different types of agents in the world. We also, with science, detect different kinds of causality or effects on the surrounding world at each emergent level in the natural world, from quantum physics through to the rise and fall of civilizations. Metaphysically speaking, that's hopeless. So as John Cobb has been reminding me for 2 decades now in Claremont, Philip, it's just too difficult to explain how mind could arise from non-mind. You'll only have a satisfactory position if you join me in affirming panpsychism, or what I call pan-experientialism, he says. And emergence is just hopeless when it comes to metaphysics. And you could take this argument today to have argued that's exactly right. Okay, conclusions. If I had time, I would then want to explore with you in continuing this thought experiment, what happens when one wants to bring in just 2 of the 3 spheres or disciplines or areas of thought that I've examined today. It turns out that the order of the 2 matters, that is, their relative priority matters. So there aren't just 3 dyads out of that one could look at, A, B, B, C, and C, A, but actually 6 dyads because of the order. Just going to list them and see where it takes your mind. 1, metaphysics as a starting point and then add science. Lots and lots of Germans for centuries have written in this vein, and sort of systematic metaphysicians. Number two, science as a starting point, then add metaphysics. Maybe Wesley's current work. Three, metaphysics as a starting point, and then add theology, but don't worry too much about the science. Well, many German idealists fit in that category. Fourth, theology as a starting point, and then add metaphysics, but don't worry too much about the science. Lots of examples. Fifth, theology as the starting point, and then add science, but not serious metaphysical reflection. Probably a lot of the theology and science discussion. Probably most of it, to be honest. Theology as a starting, last six, science as a starting point, and then add theology, but again, not serious metaphysics. Many of the popular science authors who have some faith commitment, right, in this vein. And you could sort of imagine idealized reconstructions of how the argument is likely to go for each of those six cases. And I suggest that that thought experiment is valuable because, in fact, we find patterns emerging, different patterns emerging in each of these six dyads. But I thought in my few minutes today, which have just ended, that I would do a reconstruction of the triadic debate given the nature of the three disciplines involved. Thank you very much.